2 weeks ago, I released a video where I discussed and modelled a potential Matchbox Thomas & Friends range in the style of their pre-existing toy trains. If you haven't watched that video, then I would suggest giving it a watch after this one because it will provide this video with a bit of context. This video was rather popular, and so I figured that it would be a good idea to model another selection of characters for the range, a Wave 2 if you will. It's time to boot up Blender and start modelling. I figured that I'd start with Edward the Blue Engine for this video. We often think of the main trio of Thomas and Friends, at least in terms of marketing, as Thomas, Percy and James, although Ertl frequently pushed Thomas, Henry and James as a trio instead. But there was a time where it seemed a little like they were trying to push Edward as the quote-unquote fourth main character. I'm thinking of the range of Thomas ornaments by the Leonardo collection, who released figures of Edward alongside the main trio. There was also the PC game Building the New Line, which had 4 playable characters in the form of Thomas, Percy, James and Edward. I find this character quartet interesting because you have 2 tank engines of a similar size, and then 2 tender engines of a similar size as well. When it comes to the cast of Season 1, it's difficult to say for certain which engine I'd have added to the main trio to make a quartet. I think Edward is a decent choice, but I think there's also merit to having Toby there instead, since it means each engine in the quartet is a different colour. I think either Henry or Gordon would work as well, for a bit of big engine representation. But anyway, I decided to start this video with Edward because it meant that I could reuse some of James's parts. As you'll see, quite a few elements of Edward are lifted from the James model that I'd made in the previous Matchbox video. One thing that I have made original, however, is Edward's wheel arrangement, which is wholly new. If we consider this series of characters Wave 2 of the Matchbox Thomas range, then it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that the first set of characters sold better than Matchbox were expecting, and so they were prepared to splash out a little more cash when developing the second wave. My thinking is that the first wave of characters from the last video were probably released around 1985, and so Wave 2 most likely released in 1986 to coincide with Season 2 of the show. Season 2 had quite a number of Edward focused episodes, so he'd certainly be a good fit for this wave of characters. Texturing Edward was fairly straightforward. I reused the splasher texture from Thomas. His tender texture is modified from James's, and the only part that actually required a new UV map was the sides of his cab. After that, I decided to model Edward's whistle and safety valve. Being a diecast toy range aimed at young children, I didn't want Edward's whistle to be too accurate to his TV series model because a detail like that would just break off. As I mentioned in the previous video, I think Matchbox would cover most of the details seen on the actual models, but in the form of relief detail as part of the main body mould as opposed to painted detail or separately footed parts. With Edward done, it was time to move on to the next engine. This seemed like the obvious engine to do next. I always liked it when there was a clear size difference between the smaller engines, the medium-sized engines and the big engines in any given toy line. This was one of the things I highly disliked about a lot of the Thomas merchandise from the mid-2010s onwards, particularly the diecast ranges. Sure, the early Take-Along and early Take-and-Play Gordon didn't have a super accurate reel arrangement, but I'd take one missing pair of wheels over making Gordon an 060. I've mentioned this before elsewhere, but I believe that the main reason why Edward's merchandise sold poorly during this time was because so much of it was barely distinguishable from Gordon's merchandise of the same era. I hope that if we get Edward and Gordon in the new diecast line at some point, then enough care is taken to make the 2 engines distinct from one another. When making the Matchbox Gordon, I imported both Thomas and Edward into the scene because I knew I wanted to borrow elements from both engines. I'm doing something similar to what I did for James, that is to say I want to use Thomas's 060 chassis but add parts to it in order to accommodate leading and in this case trailing wheels. I made sure that Gordon had a larger diameter smokebox and boiler compared to both Thomas and Edward. I tried extending Thomas's running board to create the rear dip in front of Gordon's cab and trailing axle, but this ended up looking very ugly, and so I made the dip a separate mesh instead. By this point Gordon was starting to take shape. Next came time to model Gordon's round-topped tapered firebox. Due to being directly on top of the sloped section of the running board, this was a little less straightforward than I'd previously imagined, and required me to use the Boolean tool. Following this came the cab. Once again I decided to use a separate mesh for the front of the cab versus the sides. Following this, I added Gordon's steam pipes and cylinder blocks. The cylinder blocks are meant to be part of the same mould as the running board, and are fairly thin in order not to interfere with the leading wheels. The final pieces of detail to add to Gordon, other than his face, were the oval-shaped buffers, followed by the frame edges at the front of Gordon's running board, and with Gordon now complete, it was time to move on to the next engine. Once again I loaded two engines into the scene, Gordon and Percy. The first thing I did was colour most of Gordon's body green, but don't be fooled, I'm nowhere near done yet. I decided to make 3 different versions of Henry. Well, this really is a part 3, modelling 3 different versions of engine number 3. The reason for this is because in the TV series, Henry had 3 different appearances. The first was his old shape, as seen in episodes before The Flying Kipper, in which he had a big crash and was sent to Crewe to be overhauled. He returned with a square-topped or bell-pair firebox, replacing his older round-topped tapered firebox. He also received a top feed at the front of his boiler, and he lost his splashers. But then, in Season 2, he regained his splashers from his old shape. Now truthfully, I don't think Matchbox would have made all 3 versions of Henry for their range. Realistically, they'd have only made one, like any other Thomas & Friends toy line. The reasoning is because they'd have to make a new body tooling for each of Henry's different guises, and to the layman each version of Henry would have just looked the same as one another, so there'd be little incentive to buy more than one. Truthfully, I think Matchbox would have either made Henry in his Season 1 style new shape without the splashers, or the Season 2 and onwards design. It depends on what reference material they would have been given at the time. I mainly included the old shape for the sake of completion, although perhaps I could make the excuse that the prototype Matchbox Henry was based on his old shape, similar to the prototype Bandai Tex Henry. One thing I did was make a new tender for Henry. Whereas Edward, Gordon and James have the standard Fowler tender design, Henry has a strange looking high-sided tender that doesn't really look like anything you'd see behind a locomotive in real life. Whilst the body is all new, I've reused the same chassis design from the other tenders. After remembering that Henry has 5 boiler bands rather than 4, I was mostly done with his old shape. After that, it was time to give Henry his new shape. I made the top feed by cloning his dome and playing around with it a little. Then came Henry's new firebox, and finally his steam pipes, which I'd borrowed from Gordon. I hope he doesn't mind. I modified them a little so that they'd look more like the ones Henry sports in the show. With that, Henry's third form was complete. Now it was just his second form that needed doing, and all that entailed was removing the splashers. And with that, all 3 Henry models were complete. As a lot of people pointed out in the comments section of the last Matchbox video, Matchbox could have very easily modified the pannier tank engine from their regular range to make duck. And I certainly agree that Matchbox probably would have done this if they'd made a Thomas range. I started by modelling the pannier tank in its original guise. I'd already modelled the chassis when making Thomas's model, so I had a bit of a head start. I noticed that compared to the 040, the pannier tank seems to have quite a lot more moulded detail, so I kinda had my work cut out for me. One thing that I think was a bit of a missed opportunity, Thomas or no Thomas, was the fact that whereas the Matchbox 040 came in a multitude of different guises over the years, as far as I'm aware the pannier tank only had one paint scheme. It would have been nice to see a BR Black or especially a London Transport Maroon version for a bit of variation. As it stands, the only version in existence just has a plain green body with a black running board and chassis, with the only 2D detail being the GWR lettering on the sides of the tanks. Incidentally, a couple of months ago I went to Sheringham and visited the old model shop. I remember it used to be called Auto Loco, but it's now called Smith's Model Railways. No relation to Smith's Toy Superstores, or WH Smith for that matter. When I was there, I came across these customised versions of the Matchbox engines, which I thought were really neat. The redone paint schemes really do wonders for these toys, particularly the pannier tank, which could almost pass as a scale model. Some really nice oddities for my collection. Also, if you're wondering why the pannier tank looks a little underscale compared to the 040, that's not a mistake on my end, I promise. That's how it is on the real toys. What this does mean is that Duck will look a little undersized compared to the other engines in the Thomas range. I know that I wanted to maintain a consistent scale with the Matchbox Thomas engines, but on the other hand I have to combine realism with idealism. At any rate, it's not the most egregious scaling issue in the world of Thomas merchandise. With the pannier tank complete, it was time to turn it into Duck, which was a fairly straightforward process. The first thing I did was use the same shade of green as Percy and Henry, and colour the funnel black. Now, whilst Duck will largely just be the same design as the pannier tank, I will have to make some changes to the tooling. For starters, the smokebox door is part of the main body mould on the original, but this section will have to be flat on the Duck model in order to accommodate a face. In short, most of the changes I've made to the body tooling are consistent with the changes made to Hornby's pannier tank to make the Hornby Duck. I've given Duck his front sandboxes. I've also smoothed out his cab roof and coloured it black. Finally, I removed the number plate detailing on the side of his cab in order to accommodate Duck's rather unconventional looking number plate. I decided to leave the running board black rather than paint it red. In the show, Duck has a red buffer beam and a black running board sides, so if a merchandise company didn't want to paint their engine's running boards, then they had a choice between casting it in red or black plastic. I've gone with black because, on the original pannier tank toy, the running board and the splashes are part of the same mould, and nobody wants to see Duck with red splashes. Finally, it's time for some rolling stock. In this hypothetical timeline, Matchbox Thomas enjoyers in 1986 would have been able to use Matchbox's pre-existing rolling stock for general goods and passenger operations. But you can't have Thomas without his faithful coaches, so it only makes sense to include them here. The first thing I did was make a reasonable facsimile of the chassis and running board of the Matchbox passenger coach. I think what I ended up with looks decent enough. I might make a full model of the passenger coach for a future video, since I might be able to use it for something. With the chassis and running board done, it was time to move on to the body. I imported Thomas into the scene, mainly for height reference. I started modelling the ends of the coach, and once I was happy with them, I added a roof and set to work on the sides. I wanted to make sure the sides of the coach lined up more or less perfectly with the ends. From there I made the windows. For this I modelled cuboids in the shape of the windows and used the Boolean effect to cut those shapes out of the body of the coach. I then used the same effect to do some relief detailing. This didn't take long to do, so from here I began texturing. I started out with Annie's textures, and once they were done, I cloned the model to make Clarabel, and made some new textures for her. Both were fairly straightforward to texture, it was just a case of adding their face on the ends and names on their sides. One thing of note is that I've given Clarabel the exact same body tooling as Annie. In the show they are slightly different. Clarabel has one window less on either side of her to represent her guards compartment. I haven't included this difference simply because almost no other toy manufacturer did either. Off the top of my head, the only ones I can think of that included this difference are Departing Now, Bandai Tex, Tomix, Diapet, Tomy Trains and Brio, and the latter two ranges use 2D windows. Every other iteration of Annie and Clarabel merchandise used the same tooling for both characters. So it's not impossible that Matchbox could have given Annie and Clarabel separate body toolings, but statistically unlikely. But with that out of the way, it's time to have a look at some proper renders of these toys. And there we are. 6 more characters in the Matchbox Thomas & Friends range. Now that we've got a few more characters, it's really starting to look like a toy line in its own right. Let me know if you'd like to see even more Matchbox Thomas characters, or if you'd like to see a What If Thomas range from a different company. With that said and done, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next week for another video.